going to record. I am recording now. Hello, and welcome to another. This won't be the last video, just because it is a lot. I don't want to read a lot. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I don't think I will, just because I still got a long ways to go, and I don't feel like reading that much. Let's see, what's the last page? 28. So I'll be reading 38. Maybe I'll finish the book tonight. Though, let's see. We will see, because sometimes I'm slow. Last night, I got drunk, and it was not fun. And I didn't get very good sleep last night, because I kept tossing and turning. Thank God I didn't puke, but still, goddamn. So I think I'm just gonna leave it to 2 chapters. Maybe I'll finish the book. It really just depends how I'm feeling, like, tired-wise, because goddamn, I wanted to keep on sleeping, and I woke up at, like, 7:30, and I knew I shouldn't go back to sleep, but I wanted to so bad. And so I was just laying down, still awake, and it was just didn't feel resting at all. So we will see. Oh god. And also my back hurts because I put up my dog wrong when I was bathing him, and I am now suffering the consequences of that. Yeah, but let's get started. We have 3 more chapters to go. I'm gonna just do 2 right now. They're very drama. There's gonna be a lot of drama. I'll just say that, because there will be. And since we're almost done with this book, Chandler, maybe we can watch it. Yes, we could watch it. Oh, I'm so excited. Okay. Alright. Hell yeah, because I own the DVD to the movie adaptation, so. Okay. So, chapter 33. Oh, and then, well, I don't feel like we need I'll just say a quick recap. Nobu has enough money to now become Sayuri's Dana. Sayuri is just, she doesn't want that. Also, she's worried that the chairman doesn't like her and might like Pumpkin. Yeah. Okay. So, chapter 33. That very night, while I lay on my futon with the room swaying around me, I made up my mind to be like the fisherman who, hour after hour, scoops out fish with his net. Whenever thoughts of the chairman drifted up from within me, I would scoop them out and scoop them out again and again until none of them were left. It would have been a clever system, I'm sure, if I could have made it work. But when I had even a single thought of him, I could never catch it before it sped away and carried me to the very place from which I'd banished my thoughts. I will repress these feelings. The repression is real. She just wants to forget about the chairman, but she can't because she loves him. And that's the sad reality of a lot of people. A lot of unrequited love. Yeah. It would have been a clever system, I'm sure, if I could have made it work. But when I had even a single thought of him, I could never catch it before it sped away and carried me to the very place from which I'd banished my thoughts. Many times I stopped myself and said, "Don't think of the chairman. Think of Nobu instead." And very deliberately, I pictured myself meeting Nobu somewhere in Kyoto. But then something always went wrong. The spot I the spot I pictured might be where I'd often imagined myself encountering the chairman, for example. And then in an instant, I was lost in thoughts of the chairman once again. I went on this way for weeks, trying to remake myself. Sometimes when I was free for a while from thinking about the chairman, I began to feel as if a pit had opened up within me. I had no appetite even when little Etsuko came late at night, carrying me a bowl of clear broth. A few times I did manage to focus my mind clearly on Nobu. I grew so numbed I seemed to feel nothing at all. While putting on my makeup, my face hung like a kimono from a rod. Auntie told me I looked like a ghost. I went to parties and banquets as usual, but I knelt in silence with my hands in my lap. I knew Nobu was on the point of proposing himself as my danna, so I waited every day for the news to reach me. But the weeks dragged on without any word. Then one hot afternoon at the end of June, nearly a month after I'd given back the rock, Mother brought in a newspaper while I was eating lunch and opened it to show me an article entitled, "Iwamura Electric Secures Financing from Mitsubishi Bank." I expected to find all sorts of references to Nobu and the minister and certainly to the chairman, but mostly the article gave a lot of information I can't even remember. It told that Iwamura Electric's designation had been changed by the Allied Occupation Authorities from, I don't remember, a class something to a class something else, which meant, as the article went on to explain, that the company was no longer restricted from entering into contracts, applying for loans, and so forth. Several paragraphs followed, all about rates of interest and lines of credit, and then finally about a very large loan secured the day before, uh, and then about, yeah, and then finally about a very large loan secured the day before from the Mitsubishi Bank. It was a difficult article to read, full of numbers and business terms. When I finished, I looked up at Mother, kneeling on the other side of the table. Iwamura, Iwamura Electric's fortunes have turned around completely, she said. Why didn't you tell me about this? Mother, I hardly even understand what I've just read. It's no wonder we've heard it's no wonder we've heard so much from Nobu Toshikazu these past few days. You must know he's proposed himself as your danna. I was thinking of turning him down. Who wants a man with an uncertain future? Now I can see why you've seemed so distracted these past few weeks. Well, now you can relax. It's finally happening. We all know how fond you've been of Nobu these many years. I went on gazing down at the table just like a proper daughter, but I'm sure I wore a pained expression on my face, because in one moment, Mother went on. You mustn't be listless this way when Nobu wants you in his bed. Perhaps your health isn't what it should be. I'll send you to a doctor the moment you return from Amman, Amami. The only Amami I'd ever heard of was a little island not far off from Okinawa. I couldn't imagine this was the place she meant. But in fact, his mother went on to tell me, the mistress of the Ichiriki had received a telephone call that very morning from Irimura Electric concerning a trip to the island of Amami the following weekend. I'd been asked to go, along with Mamaha and Pumpkin, and also another geisha whose name Mother couldn't remember. We would leave the following Friday afternoon. But Mother, it makes no sense at all, I said. A weekend trip is far a weekend trip as far as Amami? A boat ride alone will take all day. Nothing of the sort. Yeah, nothing of the sort. Iwamura Electric has arranged for all of you to travel there in an airplane. In an instant, I forgot my worries about Nobu and sat upright as quickly as if someone had poked me with a pin. Mother! Yeah, Mother, I said. I can't possibly fly on an airplane. If you're sitting in one and the thing takes off, you won't be able to help it. She replied. She must have thought her little joke was very funny, because she gave one of her huffing laughs. With gasoline so scarce, there couldn't possibly be an airplane. I decided. So I made up my mind not to worry, and this worked well for me until the following day, when I spoke to the mistress of the Ichiriki. It seemed that several American officers on the island of Okinawa traveled by air to Osaka several weekends a month. Normally, the airplane flew home empty and returned a few days later to pick them up. Irimura Electric had arranged for our group to ride on the return trips. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, we were going to Amami only because the empty airplane was available. Otherwise, we'd probably been on our way to a hot springs resort and not fearing for our lives at all. The last thing the mistress said to me was, "I'm just grateful it's you and not me flying in the thing." When Friday morning came, we set out for Osaka by train. In addition to Mr. Beku, who came to help us with our trunks as far as the airport, the little group consisted of Mamaha, Pumpkin, and me, as well as an elderly geisha named Shizue. Shizue was from the Pontocho district rather than Gion, and had unattractive glasses and silver hair that made her look even older than she really was. What was worse, her chin had a big cleft in the middle, like two breasts. Shizue seemed to view the rest of us as a cedar views the weeds growing beneath it. Mostly she stared at the window of the train, but every so often she opened the clasp of her orange and red handbag to take out a piece of candy, and looked at us as if she couldn't see why we had to trouble her with our presence. From Osaka Station, we traveled to the airport on a little bus much larger than a car, which ran on coal and was very dirty. At last, after an hour or so, we climbed down beside a silver airplane with two great big propellers on the wings. I wasn't at all reassured to see the tiny wheel. I wasn't at all reassured to see the tiny wheel on which the tail rested. And when we went inside, the aisle sloped downward so dramatically, I felt sure the airplane was broken. The men were on board already. The men were on board already, sitting in seats at the rear and talking business. In addition to the chairman and Nobu, the minister was there, as well as an elderly man who, as I later learned, was regional director of the Mitsubishi Bank. Seated beside him was a man in his 30s with a chin just like Shizue's and glasses as thick as hers too. As it turned out, Shizue was the longtime mistress of the bank director, and this man was their son. We sat we sat toward the front of the airplane and left the men to their dull conversation. Soon I heard a coughing noise and the airplane trembled, and when I looked out the window, the giant propeller outside had begun to turn. In a matter of moments, it was whirling its sword-like blades inches from my face, making the most desperate humming noise. I felt sure it would come tearing through the side of the airplane, and yeah, I felt sure it would come tearing through the side of the airplane and slice me in half. Mama had put me in a window seat, thinking the view might calm me once we were airborne. But now that she saw what the propeller was doing, she refused to switch seats with me. The noise was the the noise of the engine grew worse, and the airplane began to bump along, turning here and there. Finally, the noise reached its most terrifying. Yeah, finally, the noise reached its most terrifying volume yet, and the aisle tipped level. Yeah, finally the noise reached its finally the noise reached its most terrifying volume yet, and the aisle tipped level. After another few moments, we heard a thump and began to rise up into the air. Only when the ground was far below us did anyone. Sorry. Yeah, only when the ground was far below us did someone really tell me the trip was 700 kilometers and would take nearly 4 hours. When I heard this, I'm afraid my eyes glazed over with tears, and everyone began to laugh at me. I pulled the curtains over the window and tried to calm myself by reading a magazine. Quite some time later, after Mama had fallen asleep in the seat beside me, I looked up to find Nobu standing in the aisle. Sayuri, are you well? He said, speaking quietly so as not to wake Mamaha. Oh yeah, man. That's gotta suck. I mean, I get nervous, but like that afraid. Oh no. Yeah. Sayuri, are you well? He said, speaking quietly. Yeah, speaking quietly so as not to wake Mamaha. I don't think Nobu-san has ever asked me such a thing before, I said. He must be in a very cheerful mood. And the future has never looked so promising. Mamaha stirred at the sound of her talking, so Nobu said nothing further, and instead continued up the aisle to the toilet. Yeah, that too. Yeah, serious turbulence is no joke. Alrighty. Uh. Ah, okay. Yeah, Mama has stirred at the sound of her talking, so Nobu said nothing further, and instead continued up the aisle to the toilet. Just before opening the door, he glanced back toward where the other men were seated. For an instant, I saw him from an angle I had rarely seen, which gave him a look of fierce concentration. When his glance flicked in my direction, I thought he might pick up some hint that I felt as worried about my future as he felt assured about his. How strange it seemed, when I thought about it, that Nobu understood me so little. Of course, a geisha who expects understanding from her danna is like a mouse expecting sympathy from a snake. And in any case, how could Nobu possibly understand anything about me when he'd seen me solely as a geisha, keeping my true self carefully concealed? The chairman was the only man I'd ever entertained as Sayuri the geisha, who has also who had also known me as Chio, though it was strange to think of it this way, for I had never realized it before. What would Nobu have done if he had been the one to find me that day at the Shirokawa stream? Surely he would have surely he would have walked right past, and how much easier it might have been for me if he had. I wouldn't spend my nights yearning for the chairman. I wouldn't stop in cosmetic shops from time to time to smell the scent of talc in the air and remind myself of his skin. I wouldn't strain to picture his presence. Yeah, I wouldn't strain to picture his presence beside me in some imaginary place. If you'd asked me why I wanted these things, I would have answered, why does a ripe persimmon taste delicious? Why does wood smell smoky when it burns? But here I was again, like a girl trying to catch mice with her hands. Why couldn't I stop thinking about the chairman? Why couldn't I stop thinking about the chairman? I'm sure my anguish must have shown clearly on my face when the door to the toilet opened a moment later, and the light snapped off. I couldn't bear for Nobu to see me this way, so I laid my head against the window, pretending to be asleep. After he passed by, I opened my eyes again. I found that the position of my head had caused the curtains to pull open again, so that I was looking outside the airplane for the first time since shortly after we'd lifted off the runway. Spread out below was a broad vista of blue aqua ocean, mottled with the same jade green as mottled with the same jade green as a certain hair ornament Mamaha sometimes wore. I had never imagined the ocean with patches of green. From the sea cliffs in Yoroido, uh, from the sea cliffs in Yoroido, it had always looked the color of slate. Here the sea stretched all the way out to a single line pulled across like a wool thread where the sky began. This view wasn't frightening at all, but inexpressibly lovely. Even the hazy disk of the propeller was beautiful in its own way, and the silver wing had a kind of magnificence and was decorated with those symbols that American warplanes have on them. How peculiar it was, how peculiar it was to see them there. Considering the word, considering the world only 5 years earlier. We had fought a brutal war as enemies, and now what? We had given up our past. This was something I understood fully, for I had done it myself once. If only I could find a way of giving up my future. And then a frightening image came to mind. I saw myself cutting the bond of fate that held me to Nobu and watching him fall all the long way into the ocean below. I don't mean that this was an idea or some sort of daydream. I mean that all at once I understood exactly how to do it. Of course, I wasn't really going to throw Nobu into the ocean, but I did have an understanding, just as clearly as if a window had been thrown open in my mind of the one thing I could do to end my relationship with him forever. I didn't want to lose his friendship, but my efforts to reach the chairman, Nobu, was an obstacle I'd found no way around, and yet I could cause him to be consumed by the flames of his own anger. Nobu himself had told me how to do it, just a moment after cutting his hand that night at the Ichigiki tea house, only a few weeks earlier. If I was the sort of woman who would give myself to the minister, he'd said, he'd wanted, he wanted, he wanted me, yeah, if I was the sort of woman who would give myself to the minister, he'd said, he wanted me to leave the room right then and would never speak to me again. The feeling that came over me as I thought of this, it was like a fever breaking. I felt damp everywhere on my body. I was grateful Mama had remained asleep beside me. I'm sure she would have wondered what was the matter, to see me short of breath, wiping my forehead with my fingertips. This idea had come to me. Could I really do such a thing? I don't mean the act of seducing the minister. I knew perfectly well I could do that. It would be like going to the doctor for a shot. I'd look the other way for a time and it would be over. But could I do such a thing to Nobu? What a horrible way to repay his kindness. Compared with the sorts of men so many geisha had suffered through the years, Nobu was probably a very desirable danna. But could I bear to live a life in which my hopes had been extinguished forever? For weeks I'd been working to convince myself I could live it. Yeah, for weeks I'd been working to convince myself I could live it. But could I really? I thought perhaps I understood how Hatsumomo had come by her bitter cruelty, and Granny her meanness. Even Pumpkin, he was scarcely 30, had worn a look of disappointment for many years. The only thing that had kept me from it was hope. And now to sustain my hopes, I would commit an abhorrent act. Oh wait, no. Let me trace back just a little bit. Yeah, I thought perhaps I understood how Hatsumomo had come by her bitter cruelty, and Granny her meanness. Even Pumpkin, who was scarcely 30, had worn a look of disappointment for many years. The only thing that had kept me from it was hope. And now, to sustain my hopes, would I commit an abhorrent act? I'm not talking about seducing the minister. I'm talking about betraying Nobu's trust. During the rest of the flight, I struggled with these thoughts. I could never have imagined myself scheming in this way, but in time I began to imagine the steps involved, just like in a board game. I would draw the minister aside at the end. No, not at the end. Perhaps at some other place, and I would trick Nobu into stumbling upon us. Or perhaps it would be enough for him to hear it from someone else. You can imagine how exhausted I felt by the end of the trip. Even as we left the airplane, I must have looked. Let me get some water. Yeah. Yeah, she's not thinking about that either. Yeah, we don't know. the chairman's feelings toward Pumpkin or toward Sayuri, so it makes it really difficult to gauge how he feels about the both of them. And she's gambling that she'll have a life with God damn it. Yeah, it's we might have to take a short break because I just made myself a bloody nose. Yeah, but you have to think that the chairman and Nobu are pretty close, right? And if the chairman sees that he that Nobu likes Sayuri, and like the chairman has said, the chairman owes him basically his life because he saved him from the explosion that made Nobu lose his arm and his and scarred his face. So he's just like, I see that you like this girl. I'm gonna back off. So maybe that's what's happening too. So you gotta think both ways. True, but that's a no-win situation between Nobu and the chairman. But that would be a win-lose situation for between Nobu and Sayuri. God damn it. Why did I have to fucking give myself a bloody nose? It's like bleeding a lot. Yeah, it would be a real big dick move. It would. I see where you're going with this. It's a hell of a gamble, yeah. I'm sorry, you guys. God damn it. Goddamn bloody nose. Okay. Okay. That should be the end of the bleeding now. Alright. Sorry about that. But yeah, she is doing a pretty big gamble. But yeah, let's continue. Uh. Yeah. Yeah, during the rest of the flight, I struggled with these thoughts. I could never have imagined myself scheming in this way, but in time I began to imagine the steps involved, just like in a board game. I would draw I would draw the minister aside at the inn. No, not at the inn, at some other place, and I would trick Nobu into stumbling upon us, or perhaps it would be enough for him to hear it from someone else. You can imagine how exhausted I felt by the end of the trip. Even as we left the airplane, I must still have looked very worried because Mama had kept reassuring me that the flight was over and I was safe at last. We arrived at our inn about an hour before sunset. The others admired the room in which we were the others admired the room in which we would be staying, but I felt so agitated I could only pretend to admire it. Excuse me. It was as spacious as the largest room in the Ichirikite house, and furnished beautifully with Japanese in the Japanese style, with tatami mats and gleaming wood. Long, one long wall had one long wall was made entirely of glass doors, beyond which lay extraordinary tropical plants, some with leaves as big as some with leaves nearly as big as a man, and a covered walkway led down through the leaves to the banks of a stream. When the luggage was in order, we were all of us quite ready for a bath. The inn had provided full The inn had provided folding screens, which we opened in the middle for the room for privacy. We changed into our cotton gowns and made our way along a succession of covered walkways, leading through the dense foliage to a luxurious hot springs pool at the other end of the inn. The men's and women's entrances were shielded by partitions and had and had separated tile and had separate tiled areas for washing. But once we were immersed in the dark water of the springs and moved out beyond the partition's edge, the men and the women were together in the water. The bank director kept making jokes about Mama and me, saying he wanted one of us to fetch a certain pebble or twig or something of the sorts from the woods at the wood uh, from the woods at the edge of the springs. The joke being, of course, that he wanted to see us naked. All this while, his son was engrossed in conversation with Pumpkin, and it didn't take long to understand why. Pumpkin's bosoms, which were fairly large, kept floating up and exposing themselves to the surface, and kept floating up and exposing themselves on the surface, while she jabbered away as always without noticing. Perhaps it may seem odd to you that we all bathed together, men and women, and that we planned to sleep in the same room later that night. But actually, geisha do this sort of thing all the time with their best customers, or at least they did in my day. A single geisha who valued her reputation will certainly never be caught alone with a man who isn't her danna. But to bathe innocently in a group like this, with the murky water cloaking us, that's quite another matter. And as for sleeping in a group, we didn't we even have a word for it in Japanese. Sakone, sleeping fish. If you picture a bunch of mackerel thrown together into a basket, I suppose that's what it means. Bathing in a group like this was innocent, as I say, but that doesn't mean a hand never stayed where it shouldn't. No, but that doesn't mean a hand never strayed where it shouldn't. And this thought was very much on my mind as I soaked there in the hot spring. If Nobu had been the sort of man to tease, he might have drifted over toward me, and then after we chatted for a time, he might suddenly have grabbed me by the hip or, well, almost anywhere, to tell the truth. The proper next step would be for me to scream and Nobu to laugh, and that would be the end of it. But Nobu wasn't the sort of man to tease. He had been immersed in the bath for a time, in conversation with the chairman, but now he was sitting on a rock with only his legs in the water, and a small wet towel draped across his hips. He wasn't paying attention to the rest of us, but rubbing at the stump of his arm, absent-mindedly, and peering into the water. The sun had set by now, and the light faded almost to evening. But Nobu sat in the brightness of the paper lantern. I had never seen him. Yeah, I never before seen him so exposed. The scarring that I thought was at its worst on the side of his face was every bit as bad on his damaged shoulder, though his other shoulder was beautifully smooth, like an egg. And now to think that I was considering betraying him. He would think I had done it for only one reason, and would never understand the truth. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting Nobu or of destroying his regard for me. I wasn't at all sure I could go through with it. Okay. After breakfast the following morning, we all took a walk through the tropical forest of the sea cliffs nearby, where the stream from our inn poured over a picturesque little waterfall into the ocean. We stood a long while. Yeah, we stood a long while admiring the view, even when we were all ready to leave. The chairman could hardly tear himself away. Yeah, the chairman could hardly tear himself away. On the return trip, I walked beside Nobu, who was still as cheerful as I'd ever seen him. Afterward, we toured the island in the back of a military truck fitted with benches and saw bananas and pineapples growing on the trees and beautiful birds. From the mountaintops, the ocean looked like a crumpled blanket of from the mountaintops, the ocean looked like a crumpled blanket in turquoise, with stains of dark blue. That afternoon, we wandered the dirt. Sorry, I'm getting like super warm from my blankets. Okay. Alright. That afternoon, we wandered the dirt streets of the little village and soon came upon an old wood building that looked like a warehouse, with a sloped roof of thatch. We ended up walking around to the back, where Nobu climbed stone steps to open a door at the corner of the building, and the sunlight fell across a dusty stage built out of planking. Evidently, it had at one time been a warehouse, but was now the town's theater. When I first stepped inside, I didn't think very much about it, but after the door banged shut and we had made our way to the street again, I began to feel the same feeling of a fear breaking. Because in my mind, I had an image of myself lying there on the rutted floor with the minister as the door creaked open and sunlight fell across us. We would have no place to hide. Nobu couldn't possibly fail to see us. In many ways, I'm sure it was the very spot I'd half hoped to find. But I wasn't thinking of these things. I wasn't really thinking at all, so much as struggling to put my thoughts into some kind of order. They felt to me like rice pouring from a torn sack. Hold on. Let me just do something real quick. Ugh. Doesn't help that something I need to get out of bed. And my back fucking hurts. Okay. I'm back. God, my fucking lower back really fucking hurts. I'm gonna put more hot and cold later. Goddamn. I didn't lift my knee. Yeah, I didn't lift with my knees. I lifted with my back. And that's what fucking destroyed me. But yeah, I wasn't really thinking at all, so much as struggling to put my thoughts into some kind of order. They felt to me like rice pouring from a torn sack. As we walked back up the hill toward our inn, I had to fall back from the group to take my handkerchief from my sleeve. It was certainly very warm there on that road, with the afternoon sun shining full on our faces. Shining full onto our faces. I wasn't the only one perspiring, but Nobu came walking back to ask if I was all right. When I couldn't manage to answer him right away, I hoped he would think it was the strain of walking up the hill. You haven't looked well all weekend, Sayuri. Perhaps you ought to have stayed in Kyoto. But when would I have seen this beautiful island? I'm sure this is the farthest you've ever been from your home. We're as far as we're as far from Kyoto now as Hokkaido now. For other the others had walked around the bend ahead. Over Nobu's shoulder, I could see the eaves of the inn protruding above the foliage. I wanted to reply to him, but I found myself consumed with the same thoughts that had troubled me on the airplane. That Nobu didn't understand me at all. Kyoto wasn't my home, not in the sense Nobu seemed to mean it, of a place where I had been raised, a place I'd never strayed from. And in that instant, while I peered at him in the hot sun, I made up my mind that I would do this thing I had feared. I would betray Nobu, even though he stood there looking at me with kindness. I tucked away my handkerchief with trembling hands, and we continued up the hill, not speaking a word. By the time I reached the room, the chairman and Mamaha had already taken seats at the table to begin a game of Go. Yeah, of Go. Yeah, by the time I reached the room, the chairman and Mamaha had already taken seats at the table to begin a game of Go against the bank director, with Shizue and her son looking on. The glass doors along the far wall stood open. The minister was propped on one elbow, staring out, peeling the covering off a short stalk of cane he'd brought back with him. I was desperately afraid Nobu would engage me in a conversation I'd be unable to escape. But in fact, he went over directly to the table and began talking with Mamaha. I had no idea as yet how I would lure the minister to the theater with me, and even less idea how I would arrange for Nobu to find us there. Perhaps Pumpkin would take Nobu for a walk if I asked her to. I didn't feel I could ask such a thing of Mamaha, but Pumpkin and I had been girls together, and though I won't call her crude, as Auntie had called her, Pumpkin did have a certain coarseness in her personality, and would be less aghast at what I was planning. I would need to direct her explicitly to bring Nobu to the old theater. They wouldn't come upon us there purely by accident. For a time, I knelt gazing out at the sunlit leaves and wishing I could appreciate the beautiful tropical afternoon. I kept asking myself whether I was fully sane to be considering this plan. But whatever misgivings I may have felt, they were enough to stop me from going ahead with it. Clearly nothing would happen until I succeeded in drawing the minister aside, and I couldn't afford to call attention to myself when I did it. Earlier he'd asked a maid to bring him a snack, and now he was sitting with his legs around a tray, pouring beer into his mouth and dropping in globs of salted squid guts with his chopsticks. This may seem like a nauseating idea for a dish, but I can assure you that you'll find salted squid guts in bars and restaurants here and there in Japan. It was a favorite of my father's, but I've never been able to stomach it. I couldn't even watch the minister as he ate it. "Minister," I said to him quietly, would you like me to find you something more appetizing?" "No," he said. "I'm not hungry." I must admit this raised in my mind the question of why he was eating in the first place. By now, Mamaha and Nobu had wandered out the back door in conversation, and the others, including Pumpkin, were gathered around the go board on the table. Apparently, the chairman had just made a blunder and they were laughing. It seemed to me my chance had come. If you're eating out of boredom, Miss Minister," I said, Why don't you and I explore the inn? I've been eager to see it, and we haven't had the time. I didn't wait. I didn't wait for him to reply, but stood and walked from the room. I was relieved when he stopped. When he stepped out onto Yeah, I was relieved when he stepped out into the hallway a moment later to join me. We walked in silence down the corridor until we came to a bend where I could see that no one was coming from either direction. I stopped. Minister, excuse me, I said, but shall we take a walk back down to the village together? He looked very confused by this. We have an hour or so left in the afternoon, I went on, and I remember something I'd very much like to see again. After a long pause, the minister said, I'll need to use the toilet first. Yes, that's fine, I told him. You go and use the toilet, and when you're finished, wait right here for me and we'll take a walk together. Don't go anywhere until I come and fetch you. The minister seemed agreeable to this and continued up the corridor. I went back toward the room, and I felt so dazed, now that I was actually going through with my plan, that when I put my hand on the door to slide it open, I could scarcely feel my fingers touching anything at all. Pumpkin was no longer at the table. She was looking through her travel trunk for something. At first, when I tried to speak, nothing came out. I had to clear my throat and try again. Whew, man, my heart is just like pumping. Ooh. I'm just like, oh man, I know what's gonna happen. I know what's gonna happen. But it's like, reading it, I'm just like, oh man, what's gonna happen? Okay. So, actually, let me take a sip of water. Okay. Yeah. At first, when I tried to speak, nothing came out. I had to clear my throat and try again. Excuse me, Pumpkin? I said. Just one moment of your time? She didn't look eager to stop what she was doing, but she left her trunk in disarray and came out into the hallway with me. I led her some distance down the corridor and then turned to her and said, Pumpkin, I need to ask a favor. I waited for her to tell me she was happy to help, but she just stood with her eyes on me. I hope you won't mind my asking. Ask, she said. The minister and I are about to go for a walk. I'm going to take him to the old theater and why? So that he and I can be alone. The minister? Pumpkin said incredulously. I'll explain some other time, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to bring Nobu there and Pumpkin, this will sound very strange. I want you to discover us. What do you mean, discover you? I want you to find some way of bringing Nobu there and opening the back door we saw earlier so that he'll see us. While I was explaining this, Pumpkin had noticed the minister waiting in another covered hallway through the foliage. Now she looked back at me. What are you up to, Sayuri? She said. I don't have time to explain now, but it's terribly important, Pumpkin. Truthfully, my entire future is in your hands. Just make sure it's no one but you and Nobu, not the chairman, for heaven's sake. No, or anyone else. I'll repay you in any way you'd like. She looked at me for a long moment. So it's time for a favor from Pumpkin again, isn't it? Is it? She said. I didn't feel certain what she meant by this, but rather than explaining to me, she left. I wasn't sure whether or not Pumpkin had agreed to help, but all I could do at this point was go to the doctor for my shot, so to speak, and hope that she and Nobu would appear. I joined the minister in the corridor and we set out down the hill. As we walked around the bend in the road and left the inn behind us, I couldn't help remembering the day Mama had cut me on the leg and taken me to meet Dr. Crab. On that afternoon, I felt myself in some sort of danger I couldn't fully understand, and I felt too much the same way now. My face was as hot in the afternoon sun as if I'd sat too close to the hibachi, and when I looked at the minister, sweat was running down his temple and onto his back. If all went well, he would soon be pressing that neck against me, and at this thought, I took my folding fan from my obi and waved it until my arm was tired, trying to cool myself and him. Yeah, trying to cool both myself and him. All the while, I kept up the flow of conversation until a few minutes later, when we came to a stop before the old theater with a thatched room. The minister seemed puzzled. He cleared his throat and looked up at the sky. "Will you come inside with me for a moment, minister?" I asked. I said. He didn't seem to know what to make of this, but when I walked down the path beside the building, he plodded along behind me. I climbed the stepping stone and opened the door for him. Oh my god, I'm just like, oh man. He plodded along behind me, and I climbed the stone steps and opened the door for him. He hesitated only a moment before walking inside. If he had God, I am just like so anxious right now. It's incredible. If he had frequented Gion all his life, he'd certainly have understood what I had in mind, because a geisha who lures a man to an isolated spot has certainly put her reputation at stake, and a first-class geisha will never do such a thing casually. But the minister stood inside the theater, in the patch of sunlight, like a man waiting for a bus. My hands were trembling so much that I folded my fan and tucked it into my obi again. I wasn't at all certain I could see my plan through to the end. The simple act of closing the door took all my strength, and then we were standing in the murky light, filtering under the eaves. Still, the minister stood inert with his face pointed toward a sack of straw mats in the corner of the stage. "Minister?" I said. My voice echoed so much in the little hall, I spoke more quietly afterward. "I understand you had a talk with the mistress of the Ichiriki about me. Isn't that so?" He took in a deep breath, but ended up saying nothing. "Minister, if I may say," I said, "I'd like to tell you a story about a geisha named Kazuyo. She isn't in Gion any longer, but I knew her well at one time. A very important man, much like you, Minister, met Kazuyo one evening and enjoyed her company so much that he came back to Gion every night to see her. After a few months of this, he asked to be Kazuyo's danna, but the mistress of the tea house apologized and said it wouldn't be possible. The man was very disappointed, and then one afternoon, Kazuyo took him to a quiet spot where they could be alone. Someplace very much like this empty theater, and she explained to him that, even though he couldn't be her danna." The moment I said these last words, the minister's face changed like a valley when the clouds move away and sunlight rushes across it. He took a clumsy step toward me. At once my heart began to pound like drums in my ears. I couldn't help looking away from him and closing my eyes. When I opened them again, the minister had come so close we were nearly touching, and then I felt the damp fleshiness of his face against my cheek. Slowly, he brought his body toward mine until we were pressed together. He took my arms, probably to pull me down onto the planking, but I stopped him. The stage is too dusty, I said. You must bring over a mat from the stack. We'll go over there, the minister replied. If we had lain down upon the mats in the corner, Nobu wouldn't have seen us in the sunlight when he opened the door. No, we mustn't, I said. Please bring the mat. Please bring a mat here. The minister did as I asked, and then stood with his hands by his side, watching me. Until this moment, I'd half imagined something would stop us, but then I could see that nothing would. Time seemed to slow. My feet looked to me like someone else's when they stepped out of my lacquered zori and onto the mat. Almost at once, the minister kicked off his shoes and was against me, with his arms around me, tugging at the knot in my obi. I didn't know what he was thinking, because I certainly wasn't prepared to take off my kimono. I reached back to stop him. When I dressed that morning, I still hadn't quite made up my mind, but in order to be prepared, I'd very deliberately put on a gray underrobe. But in order to be prepared, I'd very deliberately put on a gray underrobe I didn't much like, thinking that it might be stained before the end of the day, and a lavender and blue kimono of silk gauze, as well as a durable silver obi. As for my undergarments, I'd shortened my kojimaki, my hip wrap, by rolling it at the waist, so that if I decided after all to seduce the minister, he'd have no trouble finding his way inside. Now, when I withdrew his hands from around me, he gave me a puzzled look. I think he believed I was stopping him, and he looked very relieved as I lay down on the mat. It wasn't a tatami, but a simple sheet of woven straw. I could feel the hard flooring beneath. With one hand, I folded my kimono back and underrobe on one side so that my leg was exposed to the knee. The minister was still fully dressed, but he lay down upon me at once, pressing the knot of my obi into my back so much I had to raise one hip to make myself more comfortable. My head was turned to the side as well, because I was wearing my hair in a style known as Tsubushi Shimada, with a dramatic shignon loop. Oh god, I'm so goddamn warm and hot. Oh god. Yeah, because I was wearing my hair. Yeah, my head was turned to the side as well, because I was wearing my hair in a style known as Tsubushi Shimada, with a dramatic shingon looped in the back, which would have been ruined if I'd put any weight on it. It was certainly an uncomfortable arrangement, but my discomfort was nothing compared with the uneasiness and anxiety I felt. Suddenly, I wondered if I'd been thinking at all clearly when I had put myself in this predicament. The minister raised himself on one arm and began fumbling inside the seam of my kimono with his hand, scratching my thighs with his fingernails. Without thinking what I was doing, I brought my hands up to his shoulders to push him away. But then I imagined Nobu as my Dana, and the life I would live without hope, and I took my hands away and settled them onto the mats again. The minister's fingers were squirming higher and higher along the inside of my thigh. It was impossible not to feel them. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the door. Perhaps it would open even now, before the minister had gone any further. But at that moment, I heard the jingling of his belt and then the zip of his pants. And a moment later, he was forcing himself inside me. Somehow, I felt like a 15-year-old girl again, because the feeling was so strangely reminiscent of Dr. Crab. I even heard myself whimper. The minister was holding himself up on his elbows with his face above mine. I could see him out. Subushi Shimada. Oh yeah, so yeah, she'd have had to like try and keep that shit uh, maintained. That's like a really popular style too. Uh, but yeah, yeah, the minister was holding himself up on his elbows with his face above mine. I could see him out of only one corner of my eye. When viewed up close like this, with his jaw protruding toward me, he looked more like an animal than a human. And even this wasn't the worst part, for with his jaw jutted forward, the minister's lower lip became like a cup in which his saliva began to pool. I don't know if this was the squid guts he'd eaten, but his saliva had a kind of gray thickness to it, which made me think of the residue left on the cutting board after fish had been cleaned. When I when I dressed that morning, I tucked several sheets of a very absorbent rice paper onto the back of my obi. I hadn't expected to need them until afterward, when the minister would want them for wiping myself off, if I decided to go through with it, that is. Now it seemed I would need a sheet much sooner to wipe my face when his saliva spilled onto me. And with so much of his weight on my hips, however, with so much weight on my hips, however, I couldn't get my hand into the back of my obi. I let out several little gasps as I tried, and I'm afraid the minister mistook them for excitement, or in any case, he grew even more and more energetic, and now the pool of saliva in his lip was being jostled with such violent shock waves I could hardly believe it held together rather than spilling out in a stream. All I could do was pinch my eyes shut and wait. I felt as sick as if I had been laying in the bottom of a little boat, tossed about on the waves, and with my head banging again and again against the side. Then all at once the minister made a groaning noise and held very still for a bit, and at the same time I felt his saliva spill onto my cheek. I tried to reach the rice paper again. I tried again to reach the rice paper in my obi, but now the minister was lying collapsed upon me, breathing as heavily as if he'd just run a race. Yeah. Yeah. I could just picture your face right now, Chandler. You're making the same face. I'm I bet on my life you're making that same face. You're just like, I don't want to hear that. Too bad this book is very detailed. Yeah. I tried again to reach the rice paper in my obi, but now the minister was lying collapsed upon me, breathing as heavily as if he'd just run a race. I was about to push him off when I heard a scraping sound outside. My feelings of disgust had been so loud within me they'd nearly drowned out everything else. But now that I remembered Nobu, I could feel my heart pounding once again. I heard another scrape. It was the sound of someone on the stone steps. The minister seemed to have no idea what was about to happen to him. He raised his head and pointed it toward the door with only the mildest interest, as if he expected to see a bird there. And then the door creaked open, and the sunlight flooded over us. I had to squint, but I could make out two figures. There was Pumpkin. She had come to the theater just as I had hoped she would. But the man peering down from beside her wasn't Nobu at all. I had no notion of why she had done it, but Pumpkin had brought the chairman instead. Oh boy! And that's the end of that chapter. Oh boy! Pumpkin totally dunked on her. Totally dunked on her. Okay. And now, maybe you were already expecting this. I feel, yeah. Oh yeah. I feel like it's already expected that maybe Pumpkin would betray Sayuri just because of all the shit she's been going through. I mean, it was a stupid plan from the beginning, but then she didn't know how stupid it was when she asked Pumpkin to, like, help her. But yeah, Pumpkin betrayed her, she dunked on her, and we're about to find out why, even though we can maybe figure out why. Okay, so yeah, it was just a stupid plan. Okay, let's see what this is gonna result. Second to last chapter. I think I'm only gonna read this chapter. She should have never attempted this, but she did. Oh man. Ooh man, what's gonna happen? Ooh man. Okay, so second to last chapter. This is the last chapter I'm gonna read because I'm just gonna leave the last chapter as its own thing because I think it deserves to have its own video. Let's begin. Okay. So, I don't know if Pumpkin betraying Sayuri was a big surprise to you. Uh, you could have guessed already, but when I read this book and when I saw the movie, I was just like, oh my god, Pumpkin's bad now. Okay, so we will begin chapter 34. Chapter 34. She is done being second best. Yeah. It's the year of the pumpkin now. Oh my god, stop. That's too good. Oh my god. Okay. So yeah, on to chapter 34. Chapter 34. I can scarcely remember anything after that door opened, for I think the blood may have drained out of me. I went so cold and numb, I know the minister climbed off me, and perhaps I pushed him off. I do remember weeping and asking if he'd seen the same thing I had, whether it really had been the chairman standing there in the doorway. I hadn't been able to see I hadn't been able to make out anything of the chairman's expression. She's just gonna go ape shit. Oh my god. Yes. Oh my god. Pumpkin is definitely Daisy at this moment. God, poor Pumpkin. She deserved better. She did. But then all this stuff happened to her and she's just like she just wants revenge. She just wants to fuck up other people's lives because her life has already been fucked over. I do remember weeping and asking if he had seen the same thing I had, whether it had, whether it really had been the chairman standing there in the doorway. I hadn't been able to make out anything of the chairman's expression, with the late afternoon sun behind him, and yet when the door closed again, I couldn't help imagining I'd seen on his face some of the shock I myself was feeling. I didn't know if the shock was really there, and I doubted it was. But when we feel pain, even the blossoming trees seemed weighted with suffering to us, and in just the same way, after seeing the chairman there, well, I would have found my own pain reflected on anything I'd looked at. If you consider that if you consider that I'd taken the minister to that empty theater for the very purpose of putting myself in danger, so that the knife would come slumming down onto the chopping block, so to speak, I'm sure you'll understand that amid the worry and fear and disgust that almost overwhelmed me, I'd also been feeling a certain excitement. In the instant before the door opened, I could almost sense my life expanding just like a river whose waters had begun to swell. For I had never before taken such a drastic step to change the course of my own future. I was like a child tiptoeing along the precipice overlooking the sea, and yet somehow I hadn't imagined a great wave might come and strike me there and wash everything away. When the chaos of feelings receded, and I slowly became aware of myself again, Mamaha was kneeling above me. I was puzzled to find that I wasn't in the old theater at all any longer, but rather looking up from the tatami floor of a dark little room at the inn. I don't recall anything about leaving the theater, but I must have done it somehow. Later, Mamaha told me I'd gone to the proprietor to ask for a quiet place to rest. He'd recognized that I wasn't feeling well and had gone to find Mamaha soon afterward. Fortunately, Mamaha seemed willing to believe I was truly ill and left me there. Later, as I wandered back toward the room in a daze and with a terrible feeling of dread, I saw Pumpkin step out into the covered walkway ahead of me. She stopped when she caught sight of me, but rather than hurrying over to apologize as I half expected she might, she turned to focus slowly toward me like a snake that had spotted a mouse. Pumpkin, he said, I asked you to bring Nobu, not the chairman. I don't understand. Yes, it must be hard for you to understand, Sayuri, when life doesn't work out perfectly. Perfectly? Nothing worse could have happened. Did you misunderstand what I was asking you? You really do think I'm stupid? She said. I was bewildered and stood a long moment in silence. I thought you were my friend, I said at last. I thought you were my friend too, once, but that was a long time ago. You talk as if I've done something to harm you, Pumpkin, but no. You'd never do anything like that, would you? Not the perfect Miss Nita Sayuri. I suppose it doesn't matter that you took my place as the daughter of the Okiya, Do you remember that, Saidi? After I'd gone out of my way to help you with that doctor, whatever his name was, after I'd risked making Hatsumomo furious at me for helping you, then you turned it all around and stole what was mine. I've been wondering all these months why you brought me into this little gathering with the minister. I'm sorry it wasn't so easy for you to take advantage of me this time. But Pumpkin, I interrupted, couldn't you just have refused to help me? Why did you have to bring the chairman? She stood up to her full height. I know perfectly well how you feel about him, she said. Whenever there's nobody looking, your eyes hang all over him like fur on a dog. She was so angry she had bitten her lip. I could see a smudge of lipstick on her teeth. She'd set out to hurt me, I now realized, in the worst way she could. You took something from me a long time ago, Sayuri. How does it feel? She said. Her nostrils were flared, her face consumed with anger like a burning twig. It was as though the spirit of Hatsumomo had been living trapped inside her all these years and had finally broken free. During the rest of that evening, I remember nothing but a blur of events and how much I dreaded every moment ahead of me, while the others sat around drinking and laughing. All I could do, all I could, it was, yeah, it was all I could do to pretend to laugh. Yeah, while the others sat around drinking and laughing, it was all I could do to pretend to laugh. I must have spent the entire night flushed red, because from time to time, Mama had touched my cheek to see if I was feverish. I had seated myself as far away from the chairman as I could, so that our eyes would never have to meet, and I didn't manage to make it through the evening without confronting him. But later, as we were all preparing for bed, I stepped into the hallway as he was coming back into the room. I ought to have moved out of his way, but I felt so ashamed I gave a brief bow and hurried past him instead, making no effort to hide my unhappiness. It was an evening of torment, and I remember only one other thing about it. At some point after everyone else was asleep, I wandered away from the inn in a daze and ended up on the sea cliffs, staring out into the darkness with the sound of the roaring water below me. The thundering of the ocean was like a bitter lament. I seemed to see beneath everything. Yeah, I seemed to see beneath everything a layering of cruelty I had never known was there, as though the trees and the wind and even the rocks where I stood were all in alliance with my old girlhood enemy, Hatsumomo. The howling of the wind and the shaking of the trees seemed to mock me. Could it really be that the stream of my life had divided forever? I removed the chairman's handkerchief. The chairman's handkerchief from my sleeve, for I had taken it to bed that evening to comfort myself one last time. I dried my face with it and held it up to the wind. I was about to let it dance away into the darkness when I thought of the tiny mortuary tablets that Mr. Tanaka had sent me so many years earlier. We must always keep something to remember those who have left us. The mortuary tablets back in the Okia were all that remained of my childhood. The chairman's handkerchief would be what remained of the rest of my life. Back in Kyoto, I was carried along in a current of activity over the next few days. I had no choice but to put on my makeup as usual and attend engagements at the tea houses just as though nothing had changed in the world. I kept reminding myself what Mama had once told me, that there was nothing like work for getting over a disappointment. But my work didn't seem to help me in any way. Every time I went into the Ichiriki tea house, I was reminded that one day soon, Nobu would summon me there to tell me the arrangements had been settled at last. Considering how busy he'd been over the past few months, I didn't expect to hear from him for some time, a week or two perhaps. But on one, but on Wednesday morning, 3 days after our return from Amami, I received word that Iomura Electric had telephoned the Ichiriki to request my presence that evening. I dressed late in the afternoon in a yellow kimono of silk gauze with a green underrobe and a deep blue obi interwoven with gold threads. Auntie assured me I looked lovely, but when I saw myself in the mirror, I seemed like a woman defeated. I'd certainly experienced moments in the past when I felt displeased with the way I looked before setting out from the Okia. But most often I damn yeah, but most often I managed to find at least one feature I could make use of during the course of the evening. A certain persimmon colored underrobe, for example, always brought out the blue in my eyes, rather than the gray, no matter how exhausted I felt. But this evening my face seemed utterly hollow beneath my cheekbones, although I'd put on a Western style makeup just as I usually did, and even my hairstyle seemed lopsided to me. I couldn't think of any way to improve my appearance, other than asking Mr. Beku to retie my obi just a finger's width higher, to take away some of my downcast look. My first engagement was a banquet given by an American colonel to honor the new governor of Kyoto Prefecture. It was held at the former estate of the Sumitomo family, which was now the headquarters of the American Army's 7th Division. I was amazed to see that so many of the beautiful stones in the garden were painted white, and signs in English, which of course I couldn't read, were tacked to the trees here and there. After the party was over, I made my way to the Ichiriki and was shown upstairs by a maid to the same peculiar little room where Nobu had met with me on the night Gion was closing. This was the very spot where I'd learned about the haven he'd found to keep me safe from the war. It seemed entirely appropriate. It seemed entirely appropriate that we should meet in the same room to celebrate his becoming my danna. Though it would be anything but a celebration for me. I knelt at one end of the table. Excuse me. I knelt at one end of the table. Let me drink some water. I knelt at one end of the table so that Nobu would sit facing the alcove. I was careful to position myself so he could pour sake using his one arm, without the table in his way. He would certainly want to pour a cup for me after telling me the arrangements had been finalized. It would be a fine night for Nobu. I would do my best not to spoil it. With the dim lighting and the reddish cast of the tea-colored walls, the atmosphere was really quite pleasant. I'd forgotten the very particular scent of the room, a combination of dust and the oil used for polishing wood, but now that I smelled it again, I found myself remembering details about that evening with Nobu years earlier that I couldn't possibly have called to mind otherwise. He'd had holes in both of his socks, I remembered, though a slender big toe had protruded, with a nail neatly groomed. Could it really be that only 5.5 years had passed since that evening? It seemed an entire generation had come and gone. So many of the people I'd once known were dead. Was this the life I'd come back to Gion to lead? It was just as Mama had told me once. We don't become geisha because we want to live. Uh, we don't become geisha because we have no. Uh, we don't become gay. Yeah, it was just as Mama had told me once. Had once told me. We don't become geisha because we want our lives to be happy. We become geisha because we have no choice. If my mother had lived, I might be a wife and mother at the seashore myself, thinking of Kyoto as a faraway place where the fish were shipped. And would my life really be any worse? Nobu had once said to me, I'm a very easy man to understand, Sayuri. I don't like things held up before me that I cannot have. Perhaps I was just the same. All my life in Gyo, I'd imagined the chairman before me, and now I could not have him. After 10 or 15 minutes of waiting for Nobu, I began to wonder if he was really coming. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I laid my head down on the table to rest, for I'd slept poorly these past nights. I didn't fall asleep, but I did drift for a time in my general sense of misery, and then I seemed to have a most peculiar dream. I thought I heard the tapping sound of drums in the distance, and a hiss like water from the faucet, and then I felt the chairman's hand, touching my shoulder. I knew it was the chairman's hand because when I drifted my head from the table to see who had touched me, he was there. The tapping had been his footsteps, the hissing was the door on its track, and now he stood above me with a maid waiting behind him. I bowed and apologized for falling asleep. I felt so confused for that moment, I wondered if I was really awake. But it wasn't a dream. The chairman was seating himself on the very cushion where I'd expected Nobu to sit, and yet Nobu was nowhere to be seen. While the maids placed sake on the table, an awful thought began to take hold of my mind. Had the chairman come to tell me Nobu had been in an accident, or that some other horrible thing had happened to him? Otherwise, why hadn't Nobu himself come? I was about to ask the chairman when the mistress of the Ichiriki, when the mistress of the tea house peered into the room. Why, Chairman, she said, we haven't seen you in weeks. The mistress was always pleasant in front of guests, but I could tell from the strain in her voice that she had something else on her mind. She was wondering about Nobu, just as I was. While I poured sake for the chairman, the mistress came and knelt at the table. She stopped his hand before he took a sip of his tea, a sip from his cup, and leaned toward him to breathe in the same. She stopped his hand before he took a sip from his cup, and leaned toward him to breathe in the scent of the vapors. Really, Chairman, I'll never understand why you prefer the sake to others, she said. We opened some this afternoon, the best we've had in years. I'm sure Nobu-san will appreciate it when he arrives. I'm sure he would, the chairman said. Nobu appreciates fine things, but he won't be coming tonight. I was alarmed to hear this, but I kept my eyes to the table. I could see that the mistress was surprised too, because of how quickly she changed the subject. Oh, well, she said. Anyway, don't you think our Sayuri looks charming this evening? Now, mistress, when has Sayuri not looked charming? Said the chairman. Which reminds me, let me show you something I've brought. The chairman put onto the table a little bundle wrapped in blue silk. I hadn't noticed it in his hand when he entered the room. He untied it and took out a short, fat scroll, which he began to unroll. It was cracked like age, No, yeah, it was cracked with age and showed, in miniature, brilliantly colored scenes of the imperial court. If you've ever seen the scroll, if you've ever seen this sort of scroll, you'll know that you can unroll it and you'll know that you can unroll it all the way across a room and survey the entire grounds of the imperial compound, from the gates at one end to the palace at the other. The chairman sat with it before him, unrolling it from one spindle to the other, past scenes of drinking parties and aristocrats playing kickball with their kimonos cinched up between their legs, until he came to a young woman in her lovely 12 layered yeah, until he came to a young woman in her lovely 12 layered robes, kneeling on the wood floor outside the emperor's chambers. Now, what do you think of that? He said. It's quite a, it's quite a scroll, the mistress said. Where did the chairman find it? Oh, I bought it years ago. But look at this woman right here. She's the reason I bought it. Don't you notice anything about her? The mistress peered at it. Afterward, the chairman turned it for me to see. The image of the young woman was the image of the young woman, though no bigger than a large coin, was painted in exquisite detail. I didn't notice it first, but her eyes were pale, and when I looked more closely, I saw they were blue-gray. They made me think at once of the works Uchida had painted using me as a model. I blushed and muttered something about how beautiful the scroll was. The mistress admired it too for a moment and then said, Well, I'll leave the two of you. I'm going to send up some of that fresh chilled sake I mentioned, unless you think I should save it for the next time Nobu-san comes. Don't bother, he said. We'll make do with the sake we have. Nobu-san is quite all right, isn't he? Oh, yes, said the chairman. Quite all right. I was relieved to hear this, but at the same time I felt myself growing sick with shame. If the chairman hadn't come to give me the news about Nobu, he had come for some other reason, probably to berate me for what I'd done. In the few days since returning to Kyoto, I tried not to imagine what he must have seen. The minister with his pants undone, me with bare legs protruding from my disordered kimono. When the mistress... Yeah, I tried not to imagine what he must have seen. The minister with his pants undone, me with my bare legs protruding from my disordered kimono. When the mistress left the room, the sound of the door closing behind her was like a sword being drawn from its sheath. May I please say, Chairman, I began as steadily as I could, that my behavior on Amami... I know what you're thinking, Sayuri, but I haven't come here to ask for your apology. Sit quietly a moment. I want to tell you about something that happened quite a number of years ago. Chairman, I feel so confused, I managed to say. Please forgive me, but just listen. You'll understand soon enough why I'm telling it to you. Do you recall a restaurant named Sumio? It closed toward the end of the Depression, but, well, never mind. You were very young at the time. In any case, one day, quite some years ago, 18 years ago to be exact, I went there for lunch with several of my associates. We were accompanied by a certain geisha named Izuko from the Pontocho district. I recognized Izuko's name at once. She was everybody's favorite back in those days, the chairman went on. We happened to finish up our lunch a bit earlier. Yeah, we happened to finish up our lunch a bit early, so I suggested we take a stroll by the Shirakawa stream on our way to the theater. By this time, I had removed the chairman's handkerchief from my obi, and now, silently, I spread it onto the table and smoothed it so that his monogram was clearly visible. Over the years, the handkerchief had taken on a strain in one corner, and the linen had yellowed, but the chairman seemed to recognize it at once. His words trailed off, and he picked it up. Where did you get this? Chairman, I said. All these years, I've wondered if you knew I was the little girl you'd spoken to. You gave me your handkerchief that very afternoon on your way to see the play Shibaraku. You also gave me a coin. Do you mean to say, even when you were an apprentice, you knew that I was the man who'd spoken to you? I recognized the chairman the moment I saw him again at the sumo tournament. To tell the truth, I'm amazed the chairman remembered me. Well, perhaps you ought to look at yourself in the mirror sometime, Sayuri, particularly when your eyes are wet from crying, because they become... I can't explain it. I felt I was seeing right through them. You know, I spend so much of my time seated across from men who are never quite telling me the truth, and here was a girl who'd never laid eyes on me before, and yet was willing to let me see straight into her. And then the chairman interrupted himself. Didn't you ever wonder why Mamaha became your older sister? He asked me. Mamaha? Mamaha? I said. I don't understand. What does Mamaha have to do with it? You really don't know, do you? Know what, Chairman? Sayuri, I am the one who asked Mamaha to take you under her care. I told her about a beautiful young girl I'd met with startling gray eyes and asked that she help you if she ever came upon you in Gion. I said I would cover her expenses if necessary, and she did come upon you only a few months later. From what she told me over the years, you would certainly never have become a geisha without her help. It's almost impossible to describe the effect the chairman's words had on me. I had always taken it for granted that Mamaha's mission had been personal, to rid herself and Gion of Hatsumomo. Now that I understand her real motive, that I'd come under her tutelage, because of the chairman. Well, I felt I would have to look back at all the comments she'd ever made to me and wonder, I felt I would have to look back at all the comments she'd ever made to me and wonder what the real meaning behind them. And wonder about the real meaning behind them. And it wasn't just Mama who'd suddenly been transformed in my eyes. Even I seemed to myself to be a different woman. Oh, God, I'm getting so hot now. Yeah, it wasn't just Mama who'd suddenly been transformed in my eyes. Even I seemed to myself to be a different woman. When my gaze fell upon my hands in my lap, I saw them as hands the chairman had made. I felt exhilarated and frightened and grateful all at once. I moved away from the table to bow and express my gratitude to him. But before I could even do it, I had to say it. Chairman, forgive me, but I so wish that at some time years ago, you could have told me about all of this. I can't say how much it would have meant to me. There's a reason why I never could, Sayuri, and why I had to insist that Mama had not tell you either. It had to do with. Good night! Yeah, there's a reason I could never tell you. There's a reason why I never could, Sayuri, and why I had to insist that Mama had not to tell you either. It has to do with Nobu. To hear a mention of Nobu's name, all the feeling drained out of me. For I had the sudden notion that I had understood where the chairman had been leading all along. Chairman, I said, I know I've been unworthy of your kindness. This past weekend when I confess, Sayuri, he interrupted, that what happened on Amami has been very much on my mind. I could feel the chairman looking at me. I couldn't possibly have looked back at him. There's something I want to discuss with you, he went on. I've been wondering all day how to go about it. I keep thinking of something that happened many years ago. I'm sure there must be a better way to explain myself. I do hope you'll understand what I'm trying to say. Here, he paused to take off his jacket and folded on the mats beside him. I could smell here he paused to take off his jacket and folded on the mats beside him. I could smell the starch in his shirt, which made me think of visiting the general at the Suruya Inn in his room that often smelled of ironing. Back when Aramura Electric was still a young company, the chairman began, I came to know a man named Ikeda. Wait. Sorry, just have to do with him. Okay. Yeah, back when Aomora Electric was still a young company, the chairman began. I came to know a man named Ikeda, who worked for one of our suppliers on the other side of town. He was a genius at solving wiring problems. Sometimes when we had difficulty with an installation, we asked to borrow him for a day, and he straightened everything out for us. Then one afternoon, when I was rushing home from work, I happened to run into him at the pharmacist. He told me he was feeling very relaxed because he'd quit his job. When I asked him why he'd done it, he said, The time came to quit, so I quit. Well, I hired him right there on the spot. Then a few weeks later, I asked him again, Ikeda-san, why did you quit your job across town? He said to me, Mr. Iwamura, for years I wanted to come and work for your company, but you never asked me. You always called on me when you had a problem, but you never asked me to work for you. Then one day I realized that you never would ask me because you didn't want to hire me away from one of your suppliers and jeopardize your business relationship. Only if I quit my job first would you then have the opportunity to hire me. So I quit. I knew the chairman was waiting for me to respond, but I didn't dare speak. Now I've been thinking, he went on, that perhaps your encounter with the minister was like Ikeda quitting his job, and I'll tell you why I thought this. Uh, and I'll tell you why this thought has been on my mind. It's something Pumpkin said after she took me down to the theater. I was extremely angry with her, and I demanded she tell me why she'd done it. For the longest time, she wouldn't even speak. Then she told me something that made no sense. She said you'd asked her to bring Nobu. Chairman, please, I began unsteadily. I made such a terrible mistake. Before you say anything further, I only want to know why you did this thing. Perhaps you felt you were doing Iwamura Electric some sort of favor. I don't know. Or maybe you owed the minister something I'm unaware of. I must have given my head a little shake because the chairman stopped speaking at once. I'm deeply ashamed, Chairman, I managed to say at last. But my motives were purely personal. After a long moment, he sighed and held out his sake cup. I poured for him, with the feeling that my hands were someone else's, and then he tossed the sake into his mouth and held it there before swallowing. Seeing him with his mouth momentarily full made me think of myself as an empty vessel, swelled up with shame. All right, Sayuri, he said. I'll tell you exactly why I'm asking. It would be impossible for you to grasp why I've come here tonight, or why I've treated you as I have over the years, if you don't understand the nature of my relationship with Nobu. Believe me, I'm more aware than anyone of how difficult he can sometimes be. But he is a genius. I value him more than an entire team of men combined. I couldn't think of what to do or say, so with trembling hands, I picked up the vial to pour more sake for the chairman. I took it as a very bad sign that he didn't lift his cup. One day, when I'd known you only a short time, he went on, Nobu brought you a gift of a comb and gave it to you in front of everyone at the party. I hadn't realized how much affection he felt for you until that very moment. I'm sure there were other signs before, but somehow I must have overlooked them. And when I realized how he felt, the way he looked at you that evening, well, I knew in a moment that I couldn't possibly take away from him the thing he so clearly wanted. It never diminished my concern for your welfare. In fact, as the years have gone by, it has become increasingly difficult for me to listen dispassionately while Nobu talks about you. Here, the chairman paused and said, Sayuri, are you listening to me? Yes, Chairman, of course. There's no reason you would know this, but I owe Nobu a great debt. It's true I'm the founder of the company and his boss, but when Iwamura Electric was was still quite young, we had a terrible problem with cash flow and nearly went out of business. I wasn't willing to give up control of the company, and I wouldn't listen to Nobu when he insisted on bringing in investors. He won in the end, even though it caused a rift between us for a time. He offered to resign, and I almost let him. But of course, he was completely right, and I was wrong. I'd have lost the company without him. How do you repay a man for something like that? Do you know why I'm called chairman and not president? Because because I resigned the title so Nobu would take it. No, he tried to refuse. This is why I made up my mind, the moment I became aware of his affection for you, that I would keep my interest in you hidden so that Nobu could take you, that so Nobu could have you. Life has been cruel to him, Sayuri. He's had too little kindness. In all my years as a geisha, I'd never been able to convince myself, even for a moment, that the chairman felt any special regard for me. And now to know that he'd intended me for Nobu. I never meant to pay you so little attention. Yeah, I never meant to pay you so little attention, he went on. But surely you realize that if he'd ever picked up the slightest hint of my feelings, he would have given you up in an instant. Since my girlhood, I dreamed that one day the chairman would tell me he cared for me, and yet I never quite believed it would. And yet I'd never quite believed it would really happen. I certainly hadn't imagined he might tell me what I'd hoped to hear, and also that Nobu was my destiny. Perhaps the goal I'd sought in life would elude me, but at least during this one moment, it was within my power to sit in the room with the chairman and tell him how deeply I felt. Please forgive me for what I'm about to say. I finally managed to begin. I tried to continue, but somehow my throat made up its mind to swallow. No, I can't think what I was swallowing, unless it was a little knot of emotion. I pushed back down. Uh, I tried to continue, but somehow my throat made up its mind to swallow. No, I can't think. I can't. Though I can't think what I was swallowing, unless it was a little knot of emotion I'd pushed back down because there was no room in my face for any more. I have great affection for Nobu, but what I did on Amami. Here, I had to hold a burning in my throat a long moment before I could speak again. What I did on Amami, I did because of my feelings for you, Chairman. Every step I have taken in my life since I was a child in Gion, I have taken in the hope of bringing myself closer to you. When I said these words, all the heat in my body seemed to rise to my face. I felt I might float up into the air, just like a piece of ash from a fire. Unless I could focus on something in the room. I tried to find a smudge on the tabletop, but already the table itself was glazing over and disappearing in my vision. Look at me, Sayuri. I wanted to do as the chairman asked, but I couldn't. How strange, he went on quietly, almost to himself, that the same woman who looked me so frankly in the eye as a girl so many years can't bring herself to do it now. Perhaps it ought to have been a simple task to raise my eyes and look at the chairman, and yet somehow I couldn't have felt more nervous if I'd stood alone on a stage with all of Kyoto watching. Where we're sitting, we Yeah, we were sitting in a corner of the table, so close that when at length I wiped my eyes. Yeah, we were sitting at a corner of the table, so close that when at length I wiped my eyes and raised them to meet his, I could see the dark rings around his irises. I wondered if perhaps I should look away and make a little bow, and then offer to pour him a cup of sake, but no gestures would have been enough to break the tension. As I was thinking these thoughts, the chairman moved the vial of sake and the cup aside, and then reached out his hand and took the collar of my robe to draw me toward him. In a moment, our faces were so close I could feel the warmth of his skin. I was still struggling to understand what was happening to me and what I ought to say and what I ought to do or say. And then the chairman pulled me closer, and he kissed me. It may surprise you to hear that this was the first time in my life anyone has ever really kissed me. General Totori had sometimes pressed his lips against mine when he was my danna, but it had been utterly passionless. I'd wondered at the time if he'd simply needed somewhere to rest his face. Even Yasuda Akira, the man who'd bought me a kimono and whom I'd seduced one night at the Tatsumatsu tea house, must have kissed me dozens of times on my neck and face, but he never really touched my lips with his. So you can imagine that this kiss, the first real one of my life, seemed to me more intimate than anything I've ever experienced. Than anything I'd ever experienced. I had the feeling I was taking something from the chairman and that he was giving something to me, something more private than anyone had ever given me before. There was a certain very startling taste, a very as distinctive as any fruit or sweet or yeah, there was a certain very startling taste, as distinctive as any fruit or sweet. And when I tasted it, my shoulders sagged and my stomach swelled up, because for some reason it called to mind a dozen different scenes I couldn't think why I should remember. I thought of the head of steam. I thought of the head of steam when the cook lifted the lid from the rice cooker in the kitchen of our IKEA. I saw a picture in my mind. I saw a picture in my mind of the little alleyway that was the main thoroughfare of Ponkacho, as I'd seen it one evening, crowded with well wishers from after Kichi Saburo's last performance, the day he'd retired from the Kabuki Theater. I'm sure I might have thought of 100 other things, for it was as if all the boundaries in my mind had broken down, and my memories were running free. But then the chairman leaned back. But then the chairman leaned back away from me again, with one of his hands upon my neck. He was so close, I could see the moisture glistening on his lip, and still smell the kiss we'd just ended. Chairman, I said. Why? Why what? Why, everything. Why have you kissed me? You've just been speaking to me as a gift to Nobu-san. Nobu gave you up, Sayuri. I've taken nothing away from him. In my confusion of feelings, I couldn't quite understand what he meant. When I saw you there with the minister, you had a look in your eyes just like the one I saw so many years ago at the Shirakawa stream, he told me. You seemed so desperate, like you might drown if someone didn't save you. After Pumpkin told me you'd intended that encounter for Nobu's eyes, I'd made up my mind to tell him what I'd seen. And when he reacted so angrily, well, if he couldn't forgive you for what you'd done, it was clear to me he was never truly your destiny. Yeah, let me say that again. And when he reacted so angrily, well, if he couldn't forgive you for what you'd done, it was clear to me he was never truly your destiny. One afternoon, one afternoon back when I was a child in Yoroido, a little boy named Gisuke climbed a tree to jump into the pond. He climbed much higher than he should have. The water wasn't deep enough. But when we told him not to jump, he was afraid he was afraid to climb back down because of the rocks under the tree. I ran to the village to find his father, Mr. Yama- Yamashita, who came walking so calmly up the hill. I wondered if you realized what danger his son was in. He stepped underneath the tree just as the boy, unaware of his father's presence, lost his grip and fell. Mr. Yamashita caught him as easily as if someone had dropped a sack onto his arms and set him upright. We all, all of us cried in delight and skipped around at the edge of the pond while Gisuke stood blinking his eyes very quickly, little tears of astonishment gathering on his lashes. Now I knew exactly what Gisuke must have felt. I had been plummeting toward the rocks, and the chairman had stepped out to catch me. I was so overcome with relief I couldn't even wipe away the tears that spilled from the corners of my eyes. His shape was a blur before me, but I could see him moving closer, and in a moment he'd gathered me up in his arms as if I were a blanket. His lips went straight to his lips went straight for the little triangle of flesh where the edges of my kimono came together at my throat. And when I felt his breath on my neck and the sense of urgency with which he almost consumed me, I couldn't help thinking of a moment years earlier when I'd stepped into the kitchen of the Okia and found one of the maids leaning over the sink, trying to cover up the ripe pear she'd held to her mouth, its juices running down onto her neck. She'd had such a craving for it, she said, and begged me not to tell mother. And that is the end of that chapter. It would be very fitting for me to finish this book right now, but I don't want to do that. I'll do it tomorrow. See where the tale ends. Even though we can see well, second to last chapter has been a pretty happy ending so far, but we will see. We will definitely see. Alright, well, I will see you next time. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys so much.